The alarm screamed at 5:47 a.m., 17 minutes after Kellen had originally set it. His hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over an empty energy drink can that clattered to the floor like a judgment. The sound echoed through his cluttered apartment, bouncing off pizza boxes and unwashed dishes that had become permanent fixtures in his landscape of mediocrity. Kellen Voss had once been different. 3 years ago, he'd graduated with honors, his future stretching before him like an open highway. Now, at 26, he felt like he was driving in circles, each day bleeding into the next in a haze of Netflix binges, junk food, and the crushing weight of unfulfilled potential. His reflection in the bathroom mirror stopped him cold. When had his eyes become so hollow? When had his shoulders begun to curve inward like he was protecting himself from his own disappointment? The man staring back wasn't the person he'd promised. His parents he'd become wasn't the person his younger self had dreamed of being. The breaking point came during a video call with his college friend, Zephyr. While Kellen sat in his dim apartment, Zephyr beamed from what looked like a modern office, talking excitedly about the startup he'd just launched. "Man, I wake up every day feeling like I'm becoming who I'm supposed to be," Zephyr said, his energy radiating through the screen. After the call ended, Kellen sat in the silence of his apartment, surrounded by the artifacts of his stagnation. Something cracked inside, him not breaking apart, but breaking open. He thought about his grandmother, Naya, who had raised him after his parents died. She used to say, "Kellen, every sunrise gives you permission to be better than you were yesterday. Don't waste the gift." He'd been wasting it for 3 years. That night, instead of reaching for his phone to scroll mindlessly through social media, Kellen did something radical. He grabbed a notebook, one he'd bought months ago, with good intentions, and wrote a single sentence at the top of the first page. "Tomorrow, I will be 1% better than today." He didn't know it yet, but that sentence would become the foundation of everything that followed. He didn't plan a complete life overhaul or set impossible goals. He simply decided that tomorrow, he would do one small thing better than he had today. As he closed the notebook and placed it on his nightstand, Kellen felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the faintest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, barely a candle flame in the darkness of his self-doubt, but it was there. And sometimes, that's all transformation needs, to begin a single moment when someone decides they're worth the effort it takes to change. The next morning would mark day one of a journey that would reshape not just his habits, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live with purpose. He didn't know the path ahead would test every fiber of his resolve, or that he would discover strength he never knew he possessed. He only knew that he was tired of being disappointed in himself, and ready to find out who he could become. Day one almost didn't happen. Kellen's alarm went off at 6 a.m. sharp, the first small improvement from his usual snooze routine. But as his feet hit the cold floor, every fiber of his being screamed to crawl back under the covers. The voice in his head, the one that had kept him trapped for 3 years, whispered its familiar refrain. "Why bother? You'll just quit, like everything else." Instead of listening, he picked up the notebook and read his commitment aloud. "Tomorrow, I will be 1% better than today." Today was tomorrow. Today was his chance. His first victory was ridiculously small. He made his bed. The simple act of pulling the sheets tight and arranging the pillows took 30 seconds, but as he stepped back to admire his work, something shifted. His bedroom looked different, not just tidier, but intentional, like someone who cared about their space lived there. For breakfast, instead of grabbing a sugary pastry from the convenience store, he ate an apple. When his mind craved the familiar dopamine hit of social media, he did 10 push-ups instead. By lunch, he had collected a handful of tiny victories, each one barely noticeable, but somehow adding up to something larger. The real test came in week 2. Kellen had established a morning routine: wake at 6 o'clock, make the bed, eat something healthy, do 10 minutes of exercise, and write down 3 things he wanted to accomplish that day. But on day 9, He woke up feeling sick, his throat raw, and his body aching. The old Kellen would have used illness as an excuse to abandon his newfound discipline, but as he lay in bed, he remembered something his grandmother used to say: "Discipline isn't about being perfect, Kellen. It's about keeping your promises to yourself, especially when it's hard." So he made his bed, even though it took twice as long. He managed 5 push-ups instead of the usual 20. He ate soup instead of junk food. These weren't compromises, they were adaptations. He was learning that self-discipline wasn't rigid, it was intelligent. By the end of the first month, Kellen had created what his new mentor, a self-improvement podcaster named Rain Valdez, called Keystone Habits, small actions that naturally triggered other positive behaviors. Making his bed lead to cleaning his room. Eating healthy breakfast lead to making better food choices all day. 10 minutes of morning exercise became 20, then 30. But the most profound change wasn't physical. For the first time in years, Kellen began to trust himself. Each promise kept, no matter how small, deposited credibility into an account he'd been overdrawing for too long. When he said he would do something, he actually did it. This shift from self-doubt to self-reliance was subtle but revolutionary. His apartment transformed along with his mindset. The clutter disappeared, replaced by clean surfaces and purposeful organization. He bought plants, actual living things that required care and attention. Watching them grow became a daily reminder that progress, like growth, happened gradually and then suddenly. Friends began to notice. Zephyr commented during their next video call that Kellen seemed different, more present, more energetic. But Kellen knew the real change wasn't visible to others yet. It was happening in the space between who he had been and who he was becoming. In the daily choice to honor the person he wanted to be rather than settling for the person habit had made him. The foundation was set. Now came the real work. By day 47, Kellen had tasted success, and it was intoxicating. His body was stronger, his apartment was clean, and he'd even started a small side project, a blog about urban gardening that combined his newfound love of plants with his dormant writing skills. But success, he was about to learn, brought its own challenges. The resistance came in waves, each one more sophisticated than the last. First was the voice of his old self, whispering that he was becoming obsessive, that all this self-improvement was just another form of narcissism. "Who do you think you are?" it sneered. "Remember how you failed at everything else." Then came the social pressure. His longtime friend Caspian, whom he'd known since high school, started making jokes about Kellen's monk lifestyle. During their weekly hangout, Caspian rolled his eyes when Kellen ordered a salad instead of their usual loaded nachos. "Come on, man. Live a little. You're becoming boring." The comment stung because it contained a grain of truth that Kellen feared. Was he becoming rigid? Was his pursuit of betterment making him lose the spontaneous, fun-loving person he used to be? That night, he almost gave in, almost ordered pizza, and binged a Netflix series until 2 a.m. just to prove he could still be normal. Instead, he opened his notebook and wrote about the feeling. Something magical happened in that act of expression. The anxiety lost its power over him. He realized that Caspian's discomfort with his changes said more about Caspian than about him. People who are stuck often feel threatened by those who are moving forward. The biggest test came during week 8. Kellen's company laid off 30% of its workforce. And though he survived the cuts, the atmosphere became toxic with fear and overwork. His carefully constructed morning routine crumbled under the pressure of 14-hour days and weekend assignments. For the first time since beginning his transformation, he felt the familiar pull of his old habits. On a particularly brutal Thursday, he came home at 11 p.m., exhausted and defeated. His bed was unmade from the morning rush, dishes sat in the sink, and his plants looked slightly wilted. The old pattern beckoned. Order takeout, collapse on the couch, scroll mindlessly until he passed out. It would be so easy to surrender, but something had fundamentally changed in Kellen's neural wiring. Where once he might have seen failure as permission to quit entirely, he now saw it as temporary setback, part of the process, not the end of it. He didn't try to do everything perfectly that night. Instead, he chose one small action. He watered his plants, standing in his kitchen, watching water flow from the small watering can into the soil of his thriving herbs. Kellen understood something profound. Growth wasn't linear, just like plants. He would have seasons of rapid progress and seasons of consolidation. The key wasn't to never face difficulties. It was to never abandon the process entirely. This insight led to what he began calling minimum viable discipline, the smallest possible version of his routine that he could maintain even during crisis. When he couldn't do 30 minutes of exercise, he did 5 minutes. When he couldn't write for an hour, he wrote for 5 minutes. When he couldn't cook an elaborate healthy meal, he ate an apple. The resistance had taught him something crucial. Transformation wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. It wasn't about never falling down. It was about developing the strength and skills to get back up quickly. Each time he chose progress over comfort, each time he recommitted after a setback, he was building something more valuable than discipline. He was building resilience. By the end of month 3, Kellen had weathered his first real storm and emerged stronger. The resistance hadn't disappeared, but he'd learned to dance with it rather than be paralyzed by it. Month 4 brought an unexpected catalyst in the form of Lyra Thorne, a productivity consultant who joined Kellen's company to help restructure their chaotic workflow. Unlike anyone he'd met, Lyra seemed to operate from a place of calm intensity, focused but not frantic, ambitious but not anxious. During their first team meeting, she said something that stopped Kellen in his tracks. Most people are not living their lives. They're merely managing their reactions to life. The statement hit him like lightning. For 3 months, he'd been building habits and routines, but was he actually designing the life he wanted, or just creating a more organized version of the same existence? That evening, Kellen did something he'd never done before. He conducted a life audit. He listed everything he was currently doing with his time, then everything he actually wanted to be doing. The gap was enormous. He was maintaining his habits, but he wasn't pursuing his dreams. His urban gardening blog had gained a modest following, but he'd been treating it as a hobby rather than a potential career path. He loved writing, loved the research, loved connecting with readers who shared his passion for sustainable living. Yet he was still trudging to a job that drained his soul, telling himself he was being responsible. Lyra noticed his restlessness during a coffee break and offered insight that would reshape his entire approach. Discipline without direction is just elaborate procrastination, Kellen. You've built the engine, now you need to pick a destination. That weekend, Kellen made a decision that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He set a goal to transition his blog into a full-time business within 12 months. It meant learning about marketing, sales, content creation, and business development skills he'd never developed. It meant taking financial risks and facing the possibility of failure on a much larger scale. But something had changed in his relationship with fear. 3 months of small victories had taught him that he was more capable than he'd believed. Each kept promise to himself had been a deposit in a bank account of self-trust that was now substantial enough to make larger investments. He began treating his evenings and weekends like a second job, but not in the grinding, unsustainable way he'd approached things in the past. Instead, he applied the same principles that had worked with his morning routine: consistency over intensity, progress over perfection, systems over goals. He created content calendars, reached out to other gardening enthusiasts for collaborations, and started documenting his journey from corporate worker to entrepreneur. His audience began to grow, not just because of his gardening tips, but because people were inspired by his story of transformation. The breakthrough moment came during month 5, when his blog received a comment from someone named River Blackthorne, a successful entrepreneur who had built a sustainable lifestyle brand from scratch. River wrote, "Your content is good, but your story is exceptional. You're not just teaching people about plants. You're showing them how to cultivate the life they want. Have you considered turning this into something bigger?" The comment led to a video call that changed everything. River became an unofficial mentor, introducing Kellen to concepts like value creation, audience building, and scalable business models. But more importantly, River helped him see that his transformation journey was itself a valuable offering to the world. People don't just want information, Kellen, River explained. They want transformation. You've figured out how to become someone you're proud of. That's the real product you're selling. By the end of month 5, Kellen's blog had become a multimedia platform featuring articles, videos, and a podcast called Growing Forward. His audience had grown from hundreds to thousands, and more importantly, he was starting to see revenue that made his dream of entrepreneurship feel attainable, rather than delusional. The scared, stagnant man who had stared at himself in the mirror 6 months ago was becoming a memory. In his place stood someone who understood that transformation wasn't a destination, but a way of living, a commitment to becoming slightly better, slightly braver, slightly more aligned with his values every single day. 8 months into his journey, Kellen faced the decision that would define the next chapter of his life. His side business had grown beyond his wildest expectations. Growing Forward now had 15,000 subscribers, and he was earning nearly half his corporate salary from sponsorships, affiliate marketing, and a small course he'd created called Cultivate Your Life. But success brought new challenges. He was working 18-hour days, trying to excel at his corporate job while building his business. The stress was beginning to show in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of his old life: poor sleep, irregular meals, and the creeping sense that he was once again living reactively rather than intentionally. The wake-up call came from an unexpected source: his plants. The herbs and vegetables that had started his transformation journey were beginning to wilt. In his obsession with external growth, he'd neglected the very foundation that had made everything possible. That evening, as he carefully watered each plant and trimmed dead leaves, Kellen had an epiphany. Growth without maintenance was just another form of destruction. He'd been so focused on becoming someone new that he'd forgotten to nurture the person he'd already become. He implemented what he called growth with roots, an approach that prioritized sustainable expansion over rapid scaling. Instead of saying yes to every opportunity, he became ruthlessly selective about commitments that aligned with his values and long-term vision. He hired his first virtual assistant, a sharp recent graduate named Echo Ravenscroft, to handle administrative tasks so he could focus on content creation and strategy. The pivotal moment came during a performance review at his corporate job. His manager, Stellan Wright, delivered feedback that was both glowing and devastating. "Your work is excellent, Kellen, but you seem mentally checked out. We're prepared to offer you a promotion, but I need to know you're committed to being here." The promotion would mean a 40% salary increase and the security he'd craved for years. It would also mean abandoning his entrepreneurial dreams or relegating them permanently to hobby status. As he sat in Stellan's office, Kellen realized this was his Robert Frost moment, two paths diverging, and he could only choose one. That night, he created what he called a future self exercise. He wrote 2 detailed scenarios, one where he took the promotion and built a comfortable corporate career, and another where he quit to pursue his business full-time. Then he imagined himself at 65, looking back on his life from each path. The corporate version felt safe, but hollow, a life of financial security built on the foundation of abandoned dreams. The entrepreneurial version felt terrifying but alive, a life of uncertainty, balanced by the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful. The next morning, Kellen submitted his resignation. The transition wasn't smooth. There were months when money was tight, when imposter syndrome screamed that he'd made a terrible mistake, when the gap between his expenses and income felt insurmountable. But something fundamental had changed in how he approached challenges. Instead of seeing problems as proof of his inadequacy, he saw them as puzzles to solve. He diversified his income streams, launching a membership community for aspiring urban gardeners and developing partnerships with sustainable living brands. His content evolved from simple gardening tips to comprehensive lifestyle transformation, drawing from his own journey of becoming disciplined, purposeful, and resilient. By month 12, Growing Forward had become more than a business, it was a movement. Kellen received messages daily from people who had transformed their lives using the principles he shared: the power of small, consistent actions, the importance of identity-based change, the necessity of aligning actions with values. One message that particularly moved him came from a reader named Indira Whisper, a single mother who had used his content to transform not just her small apartment garden, but her entire approach to life. "You didn't just teach me to grow plants," she wrote. "You taught me to grow into the person I wanted to become." Standing in his new home office, surrounded by thriving plants, and looking out at the small backyard garden he'd cultivated, Kellen reflected on the journey. The scared, stagnant man from a year ago felt like a character from someone else's story. Yet he carried forward the most important lesson from that version of himself. Transformation was always possible, no matter how stuck someone felt. 18 months after that first morning when he'd simply made his bed, Kellen stood before an audience of 300 people at the inaugural Growing Forward conference. As he looked out at faces eager for transformation, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with influence. But this wasn't the anxious pressure he'd once felt trying to meet others' expectations. This was the purposeful weight of someone who had found their calling and was committed to serving it well. "The person I was 2 years ago would have told you that change was impossible," he began, his voice steady and warm. That person had tried and failed so many times that failure felt like identity rather than experience. "But here's what I learned. You don't have to become a completely different person overnight. You just have to become slightly better than you were yesterday." In the audience sat Velvet Stormridge, a documentary filmmaker who was capturing stories of modern transformation. She'd been following Kellen's journey for 6 months, fascinated by how someone could evolve so dramatically while remaining authentically themselves. After his keynote, Velvet interviewed Kellen about the secret to sustainable change. His answer surprised her. The secret isn't discipline, or motivation, or even goals. It's self-compassion. You have to learn to forgive yourself for being human, while still holding yourself accountable for becoming who you want to be. This philosophy had become the cornerstone of everything Kellen taught. His programs weren't about perfection. They were about progress. They weren't about eliminating all struggles. They were about building the resilience to navigate struggles skillfully. The conference was a massive success. But what moved Kellen most were the small moments. River Blackthorne, his early mentor, telling him how proud she was of the leader he'd become. Echo Ravenscroft, now his business partner, sharing how working with him had inspired her own transformation. Even Caspian, his old friend who had once mocked his changes, admitting that Kellen's example had motivated him to pursue his abandoned dream of becoming a chef. But the most profound moment came from an unexpected source. During a break between sessions, a young man approached Kellen with tears in his eyes. "I've been following your content for 8 months, he said. "I was in the same place you were, stuck, disappointed in myself, convinced I was just lazy or broken. Your story gave me permission to believe I could change too." As Kellen listened to this young man's story of transformations, small habits leading to bigger changes, self-doubt gradually replaced by self-trust, he realized something profound. His personal journey had become something larger than himself. It had become proof that transformation was possible for anyone willing to start where they were and begin. That evening, as the conference wound down, Kellen found himself in the quiet of his hotel room, writing in the same notebook where he'd first committed to being 1% better. The pages were now filled with insights, breakthroughs, setbacks, and victories, a complete record of becoming, he wrote. Today, I understand that transformation isn't about reaching a destination where you finally become good enough. It's about falling in love with the process of becoming. It's about building such a strong relationship with yourself that you trust your ability to navigate whatever comes next. The next morning, Kellen woke naturally at 5:45 a.m., no alarm needed. His body had internalized the rhythm of growth. He made his bed not because he had to, but because it was who he was now. He tended to his plants not as a chore, but as a meditation on growth and care, as he prepared for another day of serving others on their transformation journeys. Kellen smiled at the beautiful irony. In committing to become better than yesterday, he had discovered that yesterday's version of himself was never the enemy. It was the foundation upon which today's growth was built. The scared young man who had stared at himself in the mirror 18 months ago wasn't someone to be ashamed of. He was someone to be grateful for. Without his willingness to start where he was, none of this would have been possible. And tomorrow? Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to grow, to serve, to become slightly better than today. Because that's what transformation really was. Not a destination, but a way of moving through the world with intention, compassion, and the unshakable belief that growth was always possible. The story of becoming better than yesterday wasn't ending, it was just beginning. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one person at a time. And in that endless possibility for growth, Kellen had found not just success, but something far more valuable, a life of meaning, purpose, and continuous becoming.